It's time to consider Chapter 6. When most people think of psychology, and perhaps asked to name a psychologist, might think of Ivan Pavlov. Certainly his famous experiments with the bell and the dog and the drooling are amongst the quintessential experiments of psychology, except for the slight fact that he wasn't a psychologist. But we really liked his work, and his work was in the area of psychology, so by all accounts, he's a psychologist, even though, as I mentioned, honorary. He actually earned the Nobel Prize in biology for his study of digestion. So we'll look at the work of Pavlov and Pavlovian, or in other words, classical conditioning, as well as the major forms of learning other than that. And it comes down to, in order for us to exist in this world, we must be able to effectively learn, and that goes for just about any species that's bigger than a one-celled organism. And this chapter will tell us all we need to know about learning, or at least give us a very good start. So let's jump into it. Let's now begin Chapter 6, our chapter on learning. We'll start with the basic definition. Learning, a lasting change in, what do you think? Lasting change in something due to experience. As you see the hint, what is the focus of psychology? If you said mind, no, that's how we began. Psychology is the focus of the study of behavior. So in our definition, lasting a change in behavior due to experience. If you wonder why it has to have that clause in it, due to experience, there are other changes in us that are not considered learning. For example, maturation, a child rolling over, sitting up, taking a first step, cooing, not related to experience. That would be due to the biological unfolding of the brain's ability in the process of maturation. So with learning, it must be due to our experience, as opposed to maturation. In this chapter, we will focus on 5 major forms of learning. As you study, for some of these you will need to know a key individual, or perhaps even 2. For all of them, you should be able to do, off the top of your head, a definition. And for some, you'll be able to learn terms and apply them to specific examples. So let's begin. We'll start with habituation on the next slide. We'll start with habituation. Habituation is a decrease in response after repeated exposure. For my example, let's pretend that you're going to a classmate's house for a study group, and when you open the door for the first time, you're hit by cat. It's probably aversive, but if you keep going back to the house, you'll find it less and less pungent. And if you maybe move in there, if there's a nice room with a reasonable fee, you'll probably find that you barely notice the cat at all, though your guests will. So you've become habituated. Other examples, perhaps you take an apartment next to a railroad track, and in the initial time period you find it quite noisy. After a while you probably won't even notice the train when it rumbles by. Or maybe you live by a very pungent restaurant. Same example again. Basically, you'll become habituated. You'll see a decrease in your response after repeated exposure. Why is our brain made this way? Well, something familiar probably needs less attention than something novel and new in the environment. So by ignoring what we've already become familiar with, we're more able to respond successfully to new changes in our environment. Let's now consider learning through insight. This would be through a sudden flash of understanding. When I constructed the slide, I was trying to figure out what can I use to picture insight, and then I thought of these early experiments done during the time of World War I. A German by the name of Kohler found himself stranded on this island, which was a chimpanzee colony. Since the war was on, they weren't going to send a ship just for this, remove this particular scientist, so he used his time very wisely and conducted famous studies that taught us about chimpanzee learning. In these experiments, he would have something of value hanging, in this example, in a banana, and would have just debris laying around their yard. Eventually, the chimpanzees would stare and stare and stare until eventually his smartest one, Goliath, piled a series of boxes and climbed up and got the banana. He didn't learn this by Googling it. He didn't learn by watching another chimpanzee. He didn't read it. It had to be due to insight, a sudden flash of understanding. My favorite example, though, when I read the book, was that one day he had the banana hanging, but no debris laying around whatsoever, no boxes, no sticks, no wood, nothing, and the banana was still hanging there. Goliath solved this problem too. As Kohler walked through the yard, Goliath went up to him, took him by his hand, led him directly underneath the banana, ran up him, grabbed it, and ran away. So again, a sudden flash of understanding. If you've ever experienced insight learning, you know it's emotionally very satisfying. Maybe you want to say the phrase eureka. Do you know where the phrase eureka came from? Well, Archimedes was asked by the king to solve a problem for him. The king would send out gold to be made into crown and jewelry, and he was never quite sure when he got the gold back in the form of a crown or the jewelry if all the gold was in it or if the designer of the jewelry pocketed a little bit for themselves. Apparently the answer came to Archimedes when in a bathtub. When he got in the bathtub, of course, the water level would rise, and it occurred to him that if he put the raw gold in the water and recorded how much it rose, and then when it got back in the form of finished jewelry, it should rise to the exact same point. So the problem was solved. It was a brilliant flash of understanding, definitely a eureka moment, or in other words, a learning through insight moment. So far we've considered habituation and insight learning. Let's consider a third form of learning called social learning, or more formally, social cognitive learning. It's defined as learning by watching others. This involves a model which is observed and then imitated. The famous theorist is Albert Bandura. His famous supporting studies, the Bobo-Wadell experiments. You see two pictures from the Bobo-Wadell experiment. A child would watch an adult play with Bobo-Wadell, often using strange phrases that could be uniquely associated with this person and specific behaviors, and the child would be left alone in the room to see if the child will imitate. And there's various conditions in which the adult might have been praised by another adult for their behavior or chastised by another adult for their behavior. But again, the point was to see, would the child imitate? And as you might suspect, yes, they did indeed. I find that many of my students are not overly impressed by this experiment, thinking, well, why do we really need to experiment to see that people learn from observing others, that children learn from observing others? Well, my answer would be that yes, we actually do. Consider knowledge in the past. I teach human sexuality. So for example, we knew as a society that masturbation caused all sorts of strange ills to befall you, physically and emotionally. Do you know these supposed outcomes? It would include such things as acne. So imagine the poor person with a skin condition back then. Everybody knew what they were doing. Epilepsy. No sympathy for epileptics either. Blindness. Stop doing that or you'll go blind. They literally meant it. Insanity. And so on. So everybody knew that masturbation was dangerous, and yet no one had ever tested this basic knowledge. We could easily test it. I could ask two of my sections of intro to indulge in a certain number of those behaviors per day or week. My other class asked to indulge not at all. And then at the end of the semester, compare the rate of, let's say, seizures, blindness, insanity, and so on. And clearly we would not find positive results. There is no connection. So this is just a simple example to show that even when things are obvious, we do need to test our assumptions. Our assumptions are not always right. Let's consider examples of social cognitive learning. First one, let's do a serious example. Researchers want to study monkey behavior, but very difficult to study in the jungle. Monkeys move very rapidly through the treetops, leaving the person on the bottom, the researcher, lagging far behind, struggling with brush and poisonous snakes and poisonous spiders and so on. So they opted to lure the monkeys out to the beach for easy observation, and they did this with potatoes. One time a member of the troop washed the potato in salt water. This removed the sand and gave it a nice salty flavor. This might have been an example of insight in that first monkey. But the other monkeys watched this, imitated it, and apparently liked it because soon every monkey in the troop would wash its potato in the salty water. If this was a more typical semester, at this point I would ask students to volunteer examples from their own lives of children imitating adult behaviors. Since I can't share with you, or you can't share with me, let me share some stories that students have given me in the past, some of my favorites. In one particular example, it was Thanksgiving time, and the students said at their house there was the big person's table and the little person's table, and they were listening to the conversation of the little children. And at one point, one child told another child, "And you should go to rehab." Clearly, the child was imitating behavior learned at their own house. Another example I thought was cute. Back when I taught behavior change, part of the course was the students would have to choose a behavior about themselves that they elected to alter and apply behavioral principles. I thought it was a very good course. And occasionally I'd have what I call my sailors, because they used to have the issue of swearing like a sailor. One particular student didn't match my image, and I was surprised. I said, "Really, you have a problem with this?" And she said yes, and she shared an example. She said that whenever she drove and somebody did something really stupid, she would automatically say the phrase, "Jesus Christ," muttering under her breath. One time, somebody did something very stupid, and before she could utter from the back seat, from the car seat, was a very perfect, "Jesus Christ." At that point, she noted that she didn't want her children to pick up her bad language habits, and she chose that as her behavior change projects. So the moral of the story might be, if you have siblings, cousins, children, be careful, because they imitate our best and our worst behaviors. Let's take a moment and consider what neuron might be most involved in social learning. Take a moment and consider. If you said the mirror neuron, you are correct. Perhaps you've heard scientific assertions of what babies can tell, what they can know, and you wonder, well, how do we possibly know that? For example, let's say if we want to know what age a baby can distinguish various colors, we would repeatedly present the baby the same color, and they would become disinterested. Then we would sneak in a different color. If they showed interest again, they can tell the difference. If they continue to be bored, they cannot tell those two colors apart. So the question is, would this be an example of learning using habituation, learning through insight, or social learning? If you said habituation, you are indeed correct. Much of what we know about very young infants comes from studies on habituation. Let's now turn our attention to another form of learning, classical conditioning. We'll define it as learning which occurs when two stimuli, or in other words, two things, are paired many times. Key theorist, if you want to say Ivan Pavlov, well, indeed you're correct. The alternate name, well, if his name was Pavlov, then the alternate name would be Pavlovian conditioning. Some students think it's Pavlovian conditioning. I don't know who Pavlov is. Since his name is Pavlov, it'd be Pavlovian. In terms of the alternate name and key theorists, make sure that you learn it now, because we'll be adding additional theorists and additional types of learning as we proceed in the course. When learning about classical conditioning, students in psychology will learn four basic terms: unconditioned stimulus, abbreviated US, unconditioned response, abbreviated UR, conditioned stimulus, abbreviated CS, and conditioned response, abbreviated CR. We can, though, save ourselves a lot of writing if we're willing to learn the four basic words. We can mix and match them in any order, and it will actually enhance our learning. So let's try to do that. Let's learn the four fundamental units of these terms. When learning about classical conditioning, students in psychology will learn four basic terms: unconditioned stimulus, abbreviated US, unconditioned response, abbreviated UR, conditioned stimulus, abbreviated CS, and conditioned response, abbreviated CR. We can, though, save ourselves a lot of writing if we're willing to learn the four basic words. We can mix and match them in any order, and it will actually enhance our learning. So let's try to do that. Let's learn the four fundamental units of these terms. Let's start with the unconditioned stimulus. This is a stimulus. In other words, it's a thing. And this thing causes an automatic or instinctive response. So our definition: a thing causing automatic/instinctive response, with the emphasis on thing. Now let's consider UR, the unconditioned response. It is it's a response, in other words, it's a behavior, and this is an automatic behavior done in reaction to the US. So the US, the stimulus, causes the UR, the unconditioned response. Think of the unconditioned response as a reflex. Next, let's consider conditioned stimulus. We learned that stimulus is a thing. Conditioned refers to learning. So this is the thing that will get learned about. Our last term, conditioned response. Well, it's a behavior, and think of it as the learned behavior. What triggers this learned behavior? The CS. So the CS, after learning, produces the CR. To help you learn this, think of it this way. Stimulus is a thing. Response is just a fancy word for behavior. Now you have to distinguish unconditioned and conditioned. I hope you look at it this way. We are in the learning chapter, and in the learning chapter we will talk about two types of conditioning. Classical conditioning. Then we'll move on to operant conditioning. We speak about conditioning in the learning chapter because conditioning is learning. So if you can remember that conditioning is learning, then you will never get conditioned and unconditioned confused. Next, please go to the video clip and watch it. As you do, you'll notice Pavlov's famous experiment. Please identify in his famous experiment what the US, UR, CS, and CR are. You'll use 4 of the 5 choices to the right. So let's start with the US. He said stimulus is a thing. Unconditioned is instinctive or automatic. So what was the automatic thing? The thing that automatically causes a behavior? It'd be the meat. Take any dog, show it the meat, and it will do an automatic behavior, drooling. In comparison, if you ring the bell, the dog's not going to do any particular behavior. So again, the US would be the meat. The UR, let's see, response is behavior. Unconditioned is automatic. So the automatic behavior would be drooling to the meat. CS, stimulus is a thing. Condition is stimulus. It's the thing that will get learned about. That would be the bell. Now remember our definition of Pavlovian conditioning, learning which occurs when two things are paired many times. What two things? Well, the US, that thing, and the CS, that thing. So ring the bell, give the dog meat, ring the bell, give the dog meat, time and time again until learning occurs. So after the learning has occurred, if you present the conditioned stimulus, that is, you ring the bell, what will be the behavior? It will be the conditioned response, which would be drooling to the bell. So to answer the question on the bottom, learning occurs when the two stimuli are paired repeatedly, the US and the CS. Make sure you listen to this narration as many times as it takes to make it fairly comprehensible, and then we'll move on to another example. At the end of the video you just watched, you saw a very famous psychologist, Phil Zimbardo, conduct a mini demonstration. Please identify the US, UR, CS, and CR. Your choices are to the right. And if you need to replay the clip, it was very quick, so feel free to do it. Obviously, Phil Zimbardo would not be conducting this particular demonstration nowadays. It was back in a different time. So let's see. Unconditioned stimulus. We said stimulus is a thing. Unconditioned is automatic. So what was the automatic thing? Well, the automatic thing would be the sound of the gun's report, the sound of the gunfire. Unconditioned response. Well, we said that's a reflex done to the US. What would be that reflex? Well, flinching to the gun's report. Flinching to the sound. In order to have conditioning occur, remember we have to pair the two stimuli many times, US and CS. So he would fire the gun, say the word relax, fire the gun, say the word relax, time and time again until, if let's say that you left his demonstration, went into your math test, and your teacher said, don't worry, you guys have got this down, you've studied well, just relax. All the students that had Phil Zimbardo would all flinch, and your math teacher would be very puzzled. So conditioned stimulus would be the thing that's learned about, which is the phrase relax. The condition response, the behavior done after learning, it would be clenching to the word relax. Again, if you need to listen to this explanation or to watch the clip again, please do so. You're about to view the infamous, notorious experiment, Little Albert. As you watch this experiment, try to identify the US, in other words, the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned response, in other words, the reflex done to the US, the conditioned stimulus, the thing that will get learned about, and the conditioned response tied to it. Let's see how you do. Did you catch the name of the famous psychologist conducting this ethically questionable experiment? Hopefully you jotted down in your notes, John B. Watson. And yes, this is an experiment which was definitely in violation of modern ethical standards. Thank goodness he video clipped it, because we would not be doing this experiment again. But to the details of it, US, the thing that causes the automatic response. If you said rat, absolutely not. Remember, the rat walked on the child's lap. The child had no different reaction from the rat than the dog. So it can't be the rat. It was the loud sound. The child would cry automatically to the loud sound. So US, loud sound. UR, the reflex done to the US, that would be crying to the loud sound. The CS, well, Dr. Watson chose many things. In this particular example, though, it would be the white rat. This neutral thing would get learned about. So remember, in any Pavlovian conditioning experiment, learning occurs because the two stimuli, the US and CS, are repeatedly paired. Put the rat out, scare the baby with a noise, put the rat out, scare the baby, and so on, until learning occurs. After learning occurs, if little Albert sees the rats, he would have the automatic response of crying to the rat, and I would assume probably a little wetting as well. When most people think of extinction, they think the loss of an animal, maybe a dinosaur, a saber-toothed tiger, maybe the rhinos of Africa, or even much of our insect life is endangered. Insects have died off by about 30% in the last 10 or 15 years. But for psychology, we won't be concentrating on the loss of an animal, we'll be concentrating on the loss of a particular behavior. Normally I would ask you to discuss this with your neighbors, but I'll just, since you're alone, ask you to think about it and decide, is it the conditioned response or the unconditioned response that will be lost in extinction? So is it unconditioned or conditioned? Well, let me help you. Can you easily lose an instinct? No, you can't. Avoid brain damage, and that instinct is with you to stay. Can you easily lose what you learned? Absolutely. Don't we do it all the time? So it would be the gradual loss of the learned response. In other words, the conditioned response. At this point, this task should be fairly simple, since we have not talked about the other form of conditioning yet. But take a moment and see if you can match Pavlovian conditioning. If you thought Pavlovian was the same as classical conditioning, you are indeed correct. Let's now consider two important concepts in the learning chapter: stimulus generalization and stimulus discrimination. Stimulus generalization is treating similar things in the same manner. Once you get that definition to your notes, see if you can predict what our definition of stimulus discrimination will be. See if you can perhaps guess it to the word. If stimulus generalization is treating them in a similar fashion, then discrimination must be treating them differently. So our definition, treating similar stimuli in a different manner. Next, consider the examples and decide if they're an example of stimulus discrimination or stimulus generalization. Then I'll give you a slightly harder example. Going to the wrong classroom. Who hasn't done that? I know I have. So treating similar things in the same fashion when you should have treated them differently. That was an accidental stimulus generalization. Grabbing the wrong keys and maybe leaving your housemate stranded. Again, you should have treated them differently, but you treated them alike as in terms of your own. Another example of stimulus generalization. Driving more carefully in bad conditions. Clearly a good case of stimulus discrimination. And next one, greeting your teacher in an email with hey. And again, treating your teacher as you would treat a friend. That would be a case of stimulus generalization, treating them the same way. Now, I can be hate up and down all around, doesn't bother me whatsoever, but I have many colleagues that just about gnash their teeth and would like to have some formality since it is a formal relationship. So, unless you know otherwise, perhaps dear professor or greetings professor might keep most teachers happier. Now you're ready for a more advanced example. Let's pretend that you're driving on 890 or 90 and you're running late and you cannot be late again to work or school, so you're speeding a little bit. And you look in the rear view and you see a vehicle in back of you with a light bar across the top. I ask my students, what does the average person do? And most agree they would hit the brakes quickly. But let's say as that vehicle gets closer, you notice several things. The light is not on the top of the car, and it's a blue light, perhaps a fireman's vehicle, instead of a red light. What do most students do when they realize that it wasn't a police car? Well, their foot hits the gas. So consider in this example, foot hitting gas and foot hitting brake. Which one was the generalization and which one was the discrimination? This would be a good point to have classmates, but sadly, we do not have classmates right now this semester. Let's consider one of the many applications of classical conditioning tied into the topic of food aversion. Do you ever have an experience in your life where you ate something and got terribly sick and in the future couldn't face the idea of that food again? If so, you've had a conditioned food aversion. And the illness might not even been related to the food you ate. You might have eaten a food and got the flu. But that pairing of that particular food and that illness became a type of classical conditioning. Conditioned food aversion is a special type of classical conditioning. Usually it takes many, many pairings of the two stimuli, such as the meat in the bell or the starter pistol and the word relax. Or maybe like in the Attack of the quack sound and the being hit by the projectile. So classical conditioning usually takes many pairings, but classically conditioned food aversions requires only one pairing. Why do you think that might be built into us, that ability to learn this one so particularly quickly? Survival value. If you poison yourself by eating a dangerous food, you might not live again to have it happen the next time. So nature has built into us a very effective way of avoiding that food in the future. So let's apply it to a useful application. Consider the wolf. Majestic, has family values, but if you're a sheep herder, you might not be so thrilled with the wolf. It might be literally eating your profits. So how can they use this conditioned food aversion? Well, take a carcass, apply poison to it, enough to make the animal sick, but not to significantly hurt it, certainly not enough to kill it. After that wolf or that wolf pack ingests that tainted meat, it will forever forward avoid sheep, thus sparing the farmer's profit and its life. So what is operant conditioning? Well, it's learning controlled by reinforcement and punishment. In other words, the consequences of the behavior. Its other name, instrumental conditioning. So now we have two pairs. We must know that Pavlovian is the same as classical, and operant is the same thing as instrumental. Key theorists? Well, who's left of the B people, the behaviorists? We already mentioned John B. Watson of Little Albert fame and Ivan Pavlov, so who's the remaining behaviorist? If you're thinking B.F. Skinner, indeed you're correct. This is the apparatus that Skinner invented to study learning in his laboratory. It had a lever for the mouse to press, and you could study all parameters of learning, such as types of reinforcement, punishment, or you could look at other topics of interest, such as drug issues, addiction issues, though Skinner never went there. Skinner often used pigeons instead. In that case, it wouldn't be a lever to press, there would be a disc to peck. This box has become ubiquitous in the study of rats and learning, and in Skinner's name, what would you think we call it? If you're thinking the Skinner box, you are indeed correct. At this point, you may or may not be so clear on the difference between Pavlovian conditioning and operant conditioning. If you're not clear, we need to fix that. Pavlovian conditioning always involves reflexive behaviors. Think of the experiments we saw. What was the reflex in Pavlov's famous experiment? Drooling or salivation. What about in Phil Zimbardo's little mini experiment with the star pistol? Flinching, as it was in the attack of the quack. So if the animal or human does not possess that particular reflex, then Pavlovian conditioning could not be done. Operant conditioning is very different. We're not going to be utilizing reflexive behaviors. It involves voluntary behaviors. Depending on the consequences you expect, the reinforcements you're trying to get, or maybe the punishers to avoid. Most of our behaviors are related to operant conditioning. Think of the many decisions that you made starting from the moment you came to consciousness this morning. To get up or to tap the alarm another time. To get out of bed and wear fresh clothes, dirty clothes, what particular clothes, to have breakfast or not, to stop on the way to work or school or not, indeed to even go to school or work or not. So operant conditioning, choice behaviors depending on the outcomes you're trying to avoid or get. We've learned that there are two terms for Pavlovian conditioning and also two terms for operant conditioning. It'd be a reasonable expectation that you would know which term goes with which. So here's a mnemonic that might help you out if you need it. We saw Pavlov's classic experiment. So hopefully it'll be easy for you in your mind to link Pavlov and classical, or in other words, Pavlovian and classical conditioning. For operant conditioning, maybe to think of using instruments in the operating room. I admit it's not operating conditioning, it's operant. It's not instruments conditioning, it's instrumental, but still, if you use this image, it'll help you to link those two terms in your mind. Now let's look at two basic operant terms, reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is any stimulus that strengthens a behavior. So if we're on the topic of reinforcement, no matter what variety we're looking at, it will be strengthening of behavior. But sadly, on our test, many of you will tell me, oh, that type of reinforcement, that weakens a behavior. And unfortunately, you'll be marked wrong. So remember, reinforcement always is designed to strengthen. Punishment, on the other hand, is designed to weaken or eliminate a behavior. We'll be looking at the two types of reinforcement and two types of punishment. There are two sets of terms that are commonly used in the industry. I use my set no matter what book my book uses. I think my set is the simplest, and simpler is better. If you said weaken, you are wrong. Remember that all types of reinforcement strengthen behaviors. So how does this negative reinforcement strengthen a behavior? Behaviors that remove unpleasant, negative, nasty conditions, those behaviors are strengthened. So again, the behavior is removing a negative situation, hence negative reinforcement. Let me give you three different examples. Let's start with a headache. Let's assume that you like to pop a pill when you get a headache. I do. What color pills do you prefer? I like little orange, round, brown ones. Maybe you like a solid white capsule or a red and red and yellow capsule, or a little pink pill, whatever. So you take a pill. The pill eliminates the negative aversive condition, the headache. So the next time you get a headache, you don't look for somebody else's pill. You look for your pill and take your pill. So the process will strengthen you popping your particular pill, hence reinforcement. So again, behaviors which eliminate negative conditions are strengthened. How about a different example? Let's say that you're trying to study, but it's too cold. What could you do? Many answers. Well, certainly you could tap up the heat, but maybe you can't afford it, so you put on your study blanket or your study hat, or drink a warm beverage, or cuddle up next to somebody. So those behaviors would take away the negative aversive condition of coldness. So the next time you're cold, you would do the same behavior again. So the behavior which takes away a negative condition, that behavior will be strengthened. Maybe one last example. Let's say it's summer and you're studying psychology. Hopefully not introductory psychology, but still you're studying psychology. But the stench of garbage is interfering. What could you do? There are many answers. Well, certainly you could take out the garbage. Perhaps it's not your garbage though. Maybe it's coming in from the outside alley. Shut the window. Maybe spray Febreze. Go into your bedroom and shut the door. Relocate to another household altogether. So the next time garbage encircles you, you'll do the same behavior, whether it was shutting the window or spraying Febreze. So behaviors which eliminate negative conditions, those behaviors will be strengthened. Let's now consider the reinforcement topic, starting with positive reinforcement. This would be strengthening behavior by adding something that would be pleasant or unpleasant after the behavior. If you're thinking pleasant, you are correct. What about examples? Let's say that you have a rich life that involves a dog, a child, and a significant other, though not necessarily in that order. What could you use as a reinforcer on any one or even all three of them? You might say food, and indeed, hopefully food appropriate. I hope you don't feed your dog avocados or grapes or chocolate. And I hope you don't feed your child alcohol-laced candy, but it could be food, toys, again, species appropriate, great, affection. Won't work on the humans, but not on the dog probably. It's a major human motivator. If you're thinking money, exactly. So that would be the topic of positive reinforcement. Let's consider negative reinforcement. Is negative reinforcement used to strengthen or weaken behaviors? Think on that for a moment. Please consider these 4 examples and decide if they are classical or instrumental conditioning. Remember, classical conditioning involves reflexive behaviors always, whereas instrumental conditioning always involves choice behaviors. Well, the first example, it sounds like you have a conditioned food aversion, definitely classical conditioning. You might ask yourself, what behavior is the person performing? They're really not performing behavior, they've been classically conditioned. Next one, choosing an iced coffee over hot tea. Apparently you're finding iced coffee more reinforcing than hot tea. I do. So definitely instrumental conditioning. Wearing one shirt over a different one. Definitely a choice behavior. There's no reflexes involved in choice in apparel selection. So that would be, again, operant conditioning. Last one might be a little tougher. So is the person performing a behavior or is it a reflexive behavior? The fear is a reflexive behavior. So since we're talking about a reflexive behavior, the fear, it is classical conditioning. So let's see if you can easily distinguish classical from instrumental conditioning. Watch the following clip and decide if it's an example of classical conditioning or instrumental conditioning. I think you'll enjoy it. It's very funny. Let's move away from the topic of reinforcement and consider punishment. Some behaviors we want to weaken, whether it's the child that swore or the dog that just decorated your carpet. So let's consider punishment by application and punishment by removal. As I mentioned earlier, there are another pair of terms which are commonly used, but I think these terms are easier, so let's stick with them. Punishment by application. Adding something, would it be pleasant or unpleasant after the behavior? And are we trying to strengthen or weaken it? Try to decide. So pleasant or unpleasant, and is it strengthen or weaken? Did you decide you're going to add something unpleasant after the behavior in order to weaken it? Then good. Let's consider old school parental behaviors, behaviors that many parents would steer far away from nowadays. How about if a child just swore? In the old days, it might be adding soap to the teeth or maybe a little hot sauce in the mouth. Probably best avoided, but definitely examples of punishment by application. Now let's consider punishment by removal. Taking away something would be pleasant or unpleasant after the behavior in order to strengthen or weaken. So is it pleasant or unpleasant, strengthen or weaken? Well, hopefully you decide taking away something pleasant, something they're going to miss in other words, after the behavior in order to weaken it. What sort of things do parents take away? Parents are not born experts in punishment by removal, but most parents will become experts in punishment by removal. So take away cell phone, video games, bicycle, privilege of staying out, privilege of having friends in. All examples of punishment by removal. Now, punishment certainly can be effective, though B.F. Skinner with his own daughter resolved to never punish her again, but instead he designed very effective schedules of reinforcing good behavior rather than try to punish bad behavior. It had to take several weeks for her to learn the new system, but it became quite effective. But if one is going to use punishment, it has to be administered in a certain sort of way to be effective. So in the next slide, we'll consider principles of effective punishment. Before you go to the next slide, though, see if you can identify any of these principles on your own. Punishment can work, but it has to be delivered with in mind the necessary conditions. A very prominent condition is it must be consistent. Pretend we're talking about a child. If that child learns that grandma lets me get away with it or the babysitter lets me get away with it, they'll try with various people on various occasions, maybe even you, so the punishment needs to be consistent. It also needs to be immediate. It helps the subject learn the connection between the behavior and the outcome much more quickly and much more effectively. In the old days, it was wait till your father gets home. You think it'd be worse sitting there thinking about it all day, but research is very clear. Immediate punishment is much more effective. For example, how many people would really drink to excess if the hangover was there all the time? That would be related to number one, consistency, and it was immediate. Probably virtually no one. Third, let's consider know why being punished. This does strongly relate to number two, the immediacy factor. If you're dealing with a human, it's good to ask, tell me please why you're being punished. Many times a young child might totally miss the connection of behavior and the punishment altogether. So perhaps if you ask your child, why are you being punished? They might sniffle and say, I told the truth. It's like, no, you hit your brother in the head with a truck. So know why. In an old intro psych textbook that I used to use, the author gave an example, kind of a sad, funny example. The author's friend had just purchased a puppy, and every time when he got home from work, there'd be a decoration on the carpet. And he would take the dogs and put the dog's nose in it. And that would happen day after day after day after day, until finally something new happened. He got home and the decoration was still on the carpet, but now it had a nose print. The poor dog apparently did not know why it was being punished. It thought that perhaps the lack of the nose print, the signature, if you will, was the issue. Let's consider another item, likely enough. The punishment could be the most draconian, the most terrible punishment, but if it's not likely enough, why worry? For example, let's pretend that all people listening to this particular lesson today sped while they drive, not egregiously, but just somewhat over the speed limit, and say we avoid the heavy ticket zones like 890 and so on. Are we all likely to get tickets? Very unlikely. Is it quite possible that none of us will get a ticket? That is the probable outcome. So the punishment has to be likely enough to occur. Next one, if on a test I ask you to list characteristics of effective punishment and you put severe, I would mark you wrong without a doubt, because punishment does not have to be severe. It has to be severe enough, which is a very large distinction. For a very delicate child, a stern word might be too severe. For another child, that would not even register. So severe enough. Last on our list, and again, these don't have a particular order, this is just how they hit my slide, no mixed messages. So don't hit your brother, slap is a mixed message. One student shared with me whenever he swore, his father would say, stop effing swearing, and that drove that particular student absolutely crazy. So again, no mixed messages. So these are some of the characteristics of effective punishment. Let's momentarily focus just on physical punishment. Of course, punishment is not always physical, but let's just focus on that right here, right now. It has many problems, perhaps the worst being that it models aggression. Since this is the learning chapter, take a moment and think which model, which learning theory says, of course, it models aggression. So which theory? If you thought social cognitive learning, indeed you are correct. Before we go on to the last few new concepts of the chapter, please take a moment and see if you can identify our four terms. At this point, it should be very easy. Do not move on until you learn these four terms if you have any difficulty. So first, unconditioned, referring to instinctive or automatic. Next, the word conditioned. Well, this is the learning chapter, and we did learn about two types of conditioning. So conditioning refers to learning. Stimulus just our fancy word for thing. Response, just our semi-fancy word for behavior. So these terms are indeed associated with classical, or in other words, Pavlovian conditioning. US, let's see, unconditioned stimulus. Stimulus would be a thing, so this would be the thing that causes the automatic behavior. The UR, a reflex, and this reflex is done in reaction to the US. So US triggers the UR. Conditioned stimulus, stimulus is a thing, condition is learning, so our thing that's neutral that gets learned about. And after learning, when the CS is presented, the organism will do the CR, the learned response. And in terms of the learning which occurs, it's because the two things, in other words, the two stimuli, the US and the CS, are paired many times. Let's continue our review. Look at the terms listed below in the gray boxes. Are they associated with classical or operant conditioning? After you decide that, please match the term on the left with the definition on the right. And then, before you go to the answer icon, please identify what causes learning occur. We know because two things are paired many times. Which two things? Please name them. Let's continue our review before we finish the chapter. Let's make sure you understand US, CS, UR, and CR. Previously you saw Attack of the Quack. Think back to that clip and identify those four terms with the examples listed below. So the US, being hit by the projectile. UR, well, flinching to being hit by the projectile. Conditioned stimulus, in other words, the thing that will get learned about. That would be the sound of the quack. And conditioned response. After conditioning occurs, that would be flinching to the word quack. So our last element of review, our Big Bang clip, I hope you enjoyed it. Was it classical or instrumental? Well, ask yourself, was Penny's behavior reflexive behaviors or choice behaviors? Certainly choice behaviors, whether to get out of a seat or to take her phone in the hallway. So if it's a choice behavior, is it classical or instrumental? Clearly instrumental. Now let's consider the important topic within operant or instrumental conditioning of schedules of reinforcement. This refers to the pattern in which the reinforcer is delivered. Why should this thing be important? Well, it will influence strongly how quickly learning occurs and also how long the organism will persist after a reinforcer is no longer present. Let's look at our four basic terms now, which will be typically combined, such as we saw the terms US, UR, CS, and CR. Well, these terms will be combined also. Now, ratio is referring to rewarding by a certain number of behaviors performed. Interval, well, there has to be behaviors in here, this one too, but the behaviors are performed within a time interval. If the behavior doesn't occur within the interval, it wouldn't be counted. Now these behaviors or time intervals can be fixed. That means the exact same number of behaviors or the exact same minutes in the time interval every time. Other time, the number of behaviors or the time interval might fluctuate. This would be a variable schedule. If you have to listen to this on a second time, perfectly fine. After that, we'll go on and combine these four terms to their basic units, their basic pairs. For these 6 schedules of reinforcement listed, please decide if they are variable or fixed, ratio, or interval. In our first example, a time frame is involved, so it has to be interval, and it's a very specific time frame. It does not fluctuate, so it has to be a fixed interval schedule. For the second one, there's no mention of time interval, so it is a ratio schedule, and there is no fluctuation, so it is a fixed ratio schedule. For our third example, there's a time interval involved, so it must be an interval schedule, and there's no variation, so it has to be a fixed interval schedule. For our fourth example, There is no time frame mentioned, so it's got to be a ratio schedule. And it does not vary, so it's got to be a fixed ratio schedule. For the fifth example, there is no time interval mentioned, so it has to be a ratio schedule, and it fluctuates, so it's got to be a variable ratio schedule. And for our last example, there is a time interval mentioned, so it has to be an interval schedule, and it fluctuates, so it has to be a variable interval schedule. Our next slide will have applied examples, so you might find it hopefully a little bit more interesting. Next, let's see if you can identify the 5 examples of reinforcement schedules on the right. For our first example with a TV remote, that would be a fixed ratio schedule. Our second example, which might apply to you perhaps in your own life, there's a time interval involved, and it is fixed, so it is a fixed interval schedule. For our third example, which is roughly the way my kitchen sink works setup, it is a fixed setup, and it is a ratio. The casino example, there is no interval involved, and the number of behaviors required varies dramatically, so it is a variable ratio schedule. Our last example, there's an interval, but it varies, so it is a variable interval schedule. The schedule of reinforcement utilized will determine how quickly the behavior will be mastered and also how resistant the behavior will be to extinction. Let's start for quickest learning. The animal trainer pictured below, would she be best served by rewarding the dog at the end of some time interval after it does the correct response, or immediately after doing the correct response? Well, if you're saying immediately after the correct response, you're correct. So for quickest learning, ratio schedules are far more effective than interval schedules. But what about resistance to extinction? You don't want to have to reward the animal every time it does a certain behavior. You'd get a very chunky animal, and you'd also have to carry dog treats. So maybe you want to be able to show off to a friend when walking the dog. Maybe you want the dog to sit when another dog is passing by. I did have a friend mention that one time her dog got off leash, she yelled sit to it before it crossed into traffic, and it had saved the animal's life. So resistance to extinction can be important in many, many circumstances. If you want the highest resistance, should it be a variable or a fixed sort of schedule? Let me give you an example so you can decide for yourself. Let's say that I have 2 students with TV remotes. One has quite a few buttons that stick quite a bit, and the other has a well-functioning remote. Let's say that each of these remotes have now lost all their battery power and are now dead. Who's going to keep tapping at the buttons the longest? The person whose remote works every single time they tap it, or the person who has to tap and never knows quite how long they have to tap? Well, clearly the person on the variable schedule will keep trying much, much longer. So variable schedules are much better for resistance to extinction than our fixed schedules. Let's now consider shaping. Have you ever gone to a place like SeaWorld or perhaps a circus and see animals do quite amazing feats? Well, how does a trainer get the animal to, say, leap up in the water and jump through a hoop, or to hold the hoop while a fellow animal does a behavior? Well, shaping was a procedure was utilized. The technical phrase is often reinforcement of successive approximations, which is just a fancy way of saying rewarding attempts that approach the goal behavior. So every time the animal gets a little bit closer to the goal that you have in mind, you give them reinforcement, and you keep moving them slowly closer and closer to the goal behavior that you desire. Shaping can be used in virtually any species, either dogs, cats, or even in this case, llamas. Please watch these 2 clips and look at the techniques that this particular trainer is using on a llama. By the way, llama owners would be very impressed by this. Most llama owners would have no idea that their animals could be trained to do such things. If you've heard that I do own llamas, it is true. And my first boy, I taught him to pick up his halter and hand it to me. I'd admit that most of the time he winged it in my direction, but I was happy enough with that, and he was happy enough to get his reward for doing so. So let's do a quick review before we proceed to our 5th and last form of learning: habituation, learning to ignore repeated stimulation. Insight learning flash of understanding. Social learning, by observing a model and imitating. Classical conditioning, pairing two stimuli many times. And the last one, operant conditioning, our next one. Do you remember this particular slide from back in our approaches chapter? Our three major B people, our three major behaviors. Which one is Pavlov, which one was Skinner, and which one was Watson? Well, upper left, indeed, would be Ivan Pavlov. Below him, with a pigeon, B.F. Skinner. And to the right, John B. Watson, alluding to his training of little Albert.